as was suggested, the topic I'm going to be talking about today is mainly anticipation, because there's actually a lot more research out there on anticipation than decision-making. But I guess arguably you could suggest that both anticipation and decision-making are part of a general late phrase called game intelligence and how important that is in team sports. So in volleyball, of course, is a very fast team sport, and it's one of those sports where there is relatively little time to be able to react to what you see. So therefore, the ability to be able to anticipate ahead of the action, what actually happens, would seem to be paramount in volleyball and all the various codes of volleyball. One thing to say to start with is that after about at least 50 years of research, the general consensus is that the ability of elite performers to anticipate is not really a product of superior vision per se. So the quality of the information that arrives at the eye and at the back of the retina is pretty much the same for elite and sub-elite performers across sports. So when the commentator often goes, the player's got a great eye or superb vision, that would actually technically be incorrect. What they should be saying is that the performer has great, what we call perceptual cognitive skills. So through years of participation in the sport, elite performers develop knowledge structures in memory that allow them to perceive and process information more efficiently. This differentiation between the role of the eye and the brain in perception actually starts off with some practical implications, and that is that ultimately the use of devices that are intended to improve function of the eye per se are unlikely to be successful in transferring to an improvement in performance on the volleyball court. So techniques like Dynavision and NeuroTracker, which have become quite popular over the last decade or two, there's no real scientific evidence to suggest that there is any meaningful transfer when we employ these kinds of devices in training. Clearly, the more you practice these tasks, the better you become at them. But the question is, does it really relate to performance on the volleyball court? And the answer seems to be no. In contrast, we know that a number of different perceptual cognitive skills underpin superior anticipation. One of these skills is the ability to pick up advanced visual cues, or what we might call postural cues, from the body shape of an opponent ahead of a key event, such as handball contact in this particular instance. Typically, the way this has been examined is using an approach called a temporal occlusion approach. And what scientists tend to do is film the task from the perspective of the performer and then selectively edit the video footage at varying times relative to ball racket contact. And what they've found here consistently across a number of different sports, at least 100 sports, including volleyball, is that experts are better at picking up information and are able to respond significantly above chance levels before ball hand or football contact. I've got an illustration of the temporal occlusion paradigm here, but unfortunately it's in soccer. So what you'll have to do is imagine yourself as the goalkeeper in soccer, and you've got to decide which of the four corners of the goals, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, the player is going to strike the ball into. And you'll see two penalties, each under 3 occlusion periods. That's one. So which corner, this same penalty, you'll see a little bit more of it. And hopefully you all get it on this third attempt. So you'll now see the first portion of ball flight. That obviously went to the top left-hand corner. Different penalty. A little bit more of it. And again, you should all be diving to the bottom right-hand corner there. So similar paradigms have been carried out in volleyball. Unfortunately, I haven't got the footage near at hand, but similar results have been observed. So this is a fairly consistent skill. Another skill that we know that underpins anticipation is the ability of elite performers to recognize structure or familiarity in evolving sequences of play. And typically the way we might look at this, for instance, is I might show you 60 offensive sequences of play in volleyball via film. Say each clip lasts about 5 or 6 seconds. And then we'd have a break, go and have a cup of coffee, come back in half an hour, and I'd show you another 60 film sequences, half of which you'd seen before the break and half were new. And what you'd find is that elite volleyball players will be better at recognizing the clips that they'd seen previously. So what happens here is through prolonged engagement, elite volleyball players demonstrate a vast library of different patterns and structure and familiar sequences within the sport. The plus point of this is that therefore when they see a pattern evolving very early on, then they can then predict what the end outcome of that pattern might be. There's also a fair bit of research that experts demonstrate more effective visual search strategies. Here we use techniques such as eye movement recording to try and identify where athletes are actually fixating their gaze. And in essence, as you can see in the picture in the top left-hand corner here, we use a very small camera that picks up an image of the scene, and a little infrared beam picks up the image of the fovea, which is the very center and most precise aspect of the visual field. And we can identify where people are looking, how long for, and in what particular sequence or search pattern. And we generally find that experts use more efficient and effective strategies in these types of scenarios. I'll come back and give some specific examples later. So there has been some work on volleyball. Most of the work has probably been on soccer, and tennis is another popular sport that's been used. More recently, actually, people have been starting to look at head rotation. And it's slightly different from point of gaze. So the point of gaze actually identifies, as I said, what the fovea is doing, whereas with head rotation, it actually looks at movements of the head. The implication being that if you move the head to the left, then the eyes will potentially move to the left as well. Just a nice illustration here of some very neat work done in elite soccer in Europe. So what they did again, use a close-up camera to look at how frequently elite midfield players would rotate the head in these types of scenarios. And what they found was that elite players were carrying out one of these rotationary head movements every half a second. So they're continuously taking visual snapshots of the field of play. We also know that experts across a variety of different sports are a lot more accurate in regards to what they expect to happen next in any given situation. So a way perhaps that we might look at this is we might show a clip of film, lasts a couple of seconds. Say in this instance, the goalkeeper throws the ball to the fullback, highlighted in the top left-hand corner. And then we might say to participants, look, who is this player most likely to pass to, and what is the rank order by which these actions are likely to occur? And what you find here is that experts are a lot more accurate at this type of task, as determined by what a panel of expert coaches think might happen and based on what actually happened in the game. So therefore, the argument is experts develop a vast library, a hierarchy of probabilities, if you like, given the context, the situation, the score in the game, the positioning of players and the ball, and knowledge of their opponents. Some things are more likely to happen than others. And this knowledge base then drives the search for more meaningful information from the display to be able to confirm or reject the original hypothesis. We also know that experts are much more resilient under pressure. I will say that stress does cause changes in the manner in which people process anticipation when they're trying to anticipate, even in elite performers, but the efforts and the impact is significantly less in these individuals. One of the first studies we did, for instance, was in karate, which was done in the late 1990s. And what we did is we presented karate Kumite fighters with life-size images of offensive sequences from an opponent. We did so under low anxiety and under high anxiety and recorded their gaze behaviors. And what we found was that under low anxiety, what tended to happen is these elite performers fixated on the head and the chest. So they moved their gaze behaviors up and down the middle line of the body and then used peripheral vision to monitor which of the two arms or legs were going to be involved in the offensive movement. Whereas in contrast, when they got more anxious, then what they did was they increased the number of fixations to peripheral areas of the display, either because they became less efficient in using peripheral vision to process information, or they had some element of hypervigilance in the sense that they didn't really know where to look, so they were looking everywhere. And the search pattern of having lots of fixations of short duration in this particular context is a more negative search strategy, a more inefficient strategy than one where you fixate centrally and use peripheral vision to pick up movement. We can use peripheral vision to pick up movement much more quickly than we can use the fovea or the central visual field. I'll skip through that. It's just a figure that just articulated what I just said or graphically highlighted that. So in essence, the ability to anticipate in volleyball, therefore, is not a product of elite performers having superior vision, but through prolonged engagement in the sport, what happens is they develop these knowledge structures that allow them to perceive the game differently and to process information in a much more effective and efficient manner. So we know that experts are better at picking up postural information. We know that they're better at recognizing structure, patterns, familiarity in evolving sequences of play. And we know they have a much more extensive knowledge of likely event or situational probabilities. And all of these different perceptual cognitive skills drive the visual system to pick up information in a much more efficient and effective manner. There is also evidence to suggest that the relative importance of these different perceptual cognitive skills probably vary as a function of individual strengths and weaknesses of a player, dependent on the type of task or situation or context that athletes are presented with. And I just wanted to provide an illustration of what I mean here. Unfortunately, it's not in volleyball. It's a soccer example again, but I'm sure you can transfer some of the concepts across to volleyball. So here we had a defender or a group of skilled and less skilled defenders watching offensive sequences of play in soccer. Some of these sequences were what we call far sequences. In other words, the ball was in the other half of the field, a long way away from the central defender. And then some that were much closer to the central defender, nearer the edge of his penalty box, for instance. So we call these near clips. And what we asked these defenders to do was to anticipate what was going to happen next, and then to decide what should be the appropriate course of action to these types of clips. And then we recorded their gaze behaviors while they performed the task. And then we did immediate think aloud verbal protocols post each scenario to try and get a better indication of the thought processes that they were using in trying to anticipate what was going to happen next. And these are the gaze data. And as you'd expect, there are differences between skilled and less skilled. But the more interesting findings here are in the comparison between far and near tasks. So what you see here is that when the ball is a long way from the defender, the far task, he is typically having much more fixations, 14.53, to a high number of fixation locations and a relatively short fixation duration. Whereas in the near task, you find that there are far fewer fixations of longer duration to a fewer number of fixation locations. And probably in the near task, what's happening is that peripheral vision is being used more. So the player is normally fixating on the ball or the lower body of the player in possession of the ball, and then using peripheral vision to monitor for motion. Whereas in the far task, the performer is having lots of fixations of short duration, trying to make himself aware of the positions and movements of players off the ball. In regards to our verbal reports, and focusing on the graph on the left-hand side here for the skilled players, some nice differences again between the far and the near task. So in the far task, much greater emphasis on pattern recognition. And in the near task, much greater emphasis on postural cues and situational probabilities. So just a little illustration there of how gaze behaviors and the different perceptual cognitive skills underpin anticipation differently across different types of scenarios. So to synthesize, the ability to anticipate therefore arises through the development of these perceptual cognitive skills. An interesting question is, how do these skills develop with age? And there isn't a lot of longitudinal research in this field. We did do a study around a decade or so ago with fairly large group of elite and sub-elite soccer players across different age groups, from under 9s right the way through to under 17. And the elite players were in Premier League academies in the northwest of England, and the sub-elite players played for their local schools and regional districts, but not in the academy environment. And we used a battery of tests, film-based tests, very similar to what I've spoken earlier about. This was the general trend in the data. And firstly, what you'll see is that there are differences in anticipation skill between these players as early as 8 years of age. And clearly the gaps, the differences in anticipation performance tends to increase over time. And this is probably a reflection of the increased practice hours that the elite soccer players are accumulating. Some of the skills develop earlier than others. So the ability, for instance, to pick up postural cues is probably one of the earliest skills to develop, whereas skills like pattern recognition and arguably the use of higher level contextual information like probabilities and context probably develops later, maybe around the age of 12, 13 years of age. This may be partly a reflection of the cognitive development of the kids, but may also be partly a reflection of the fact that in younger age groups, soccer isn't 11v11 sport. So they go 7v7, 8v8, 9v9, 10v10, don't actually start playing 11v11 until after 12 years of age. So it may also be partly a reflection of the nature of the sport that they're playing at that age. Some of you, of course, may notice this difference at 8 years of age and think that maybe there's some genetic predisposition here. Maybe these 8-year-old elite players are born with the ability to anticipate. That may be the case. I don't dismiss the fact that there may be some genetic characteristics that may impact on how quickly and how effectively we develop these skills. But when we looked at the developmental history profiles of the 8-year-olds, what we see is that even by that age, the elite players have accumulated significantly more hours in practice. So we use questionnaires, semi-structured interviews, and training logs to look back retrospectively at things like age of first engagement in the sport, how many hours did they spend in different types of sports, how many hours did they spend in soccer and in coach-led practice. And as you can see here, by age 9, there's already a substantive difference between the two levels of players in the practice hours accumulated. So my argument would be that the difference you see in the players at age 8 are probably largely a reflection of the already significant difference in practice hours that have been accumulated between groups. Nevertheless, we know that these skills develop early, and clearly they do develop as a result of biological maturity to some degree, but they mostly develop as a result of experience within the sport. So, coming back to a more applied aspect of the talk, interesting question, of course, is how do we develop these skills through coaching and instruction? And I'm going to highlight 4 potential action points here that hopefully you guys can reflect on and think about the relevance of these within the context of volleyball and the development of, if you like, game intelligence, or more specifically, anticipation. So option 1 is possibly to develop the right types of practice activities. And in a lot of the literature, scientists have differentiated between play activity, which is non-coach led, and it's activity that athletes engaging on their own, normally in their own time, and coach-led practice. And we were interested in what the relative contribution of these types of activities were to the development of game intelligence skills. And one study that we did is we used groups of players from one of the academy environments, again, in the Premier League, and we tested elite and sub-elite players. And then what we did is we split the elite players into elite excellent and elite good based on their anticipation skills, using a battery of film-based tests, as we did for the different age group of kids that I explained a minute ago. And then, having grouped them into elite excellent, elite good, what we then did is we looked back retrospectively again at their developmental history profiles, using questionnaires, training logs, and semi-structured interviews. And as you can see here, what we found is that the elite players who were excellent at anticipation had accumulated significantly more hours in play-related activity, non-coach-led play during development. Clearly, we also found evidence that the hours accumulated in practice was also integral in the development of game intelligence skills, but certainly this play activity seems to be particularly important. Now, one argument is that the kids at young age, when they engage in street sport, then they tend to replicate the same kinds of conditions that they get during match play. And this may be conducive in regards to the development of these types of game intelligence skills. An interesting question, this was a question that was posed to us by one of the top clubs in Spain a few years back, and they were interested in how they can improve decision-making skills. It was a soccer team again, decision-making skill in players. So one of the things we thought we'd do is we'd go and video practice and do what we call a time use analysis. So we code the video to try and identify the types of practice activities that coaches were having athletes engage in. And some of these activities we classified as non-decision making, so which is the purpley bar here. So these would be things like warming up, warming down, physical work, working with the ball on skills, but not against an opponent, or one-on-one against an opponent, but with no tactical and strategic decision-making. So these were no decision-making scenarios. And then the rest of activities, things like small-sided games, conditioned games, match play, we suggested that they required decision-making opportunities, or presented decision-making opportunities for the players. Anyway, when we coded the number of practice sessions, and what we found here is that less than half the time were players actually having to make decisions in training practice. And I guess the interesting question is that optimal use of practice time, and the argument being that maybe the more opportunities you have for players to anticipate and to make decisions, then the more opportunity there is for trial and error learning and to try and improve those kinds of skills. Arguably, you could possibly suggest that in the adult age group, maybe the current split is not necessarily a bad thing, in so much as that, one could argue that if by adult age the players haven't developed great anticipation and decision-making skill, then it's a little bit late in the process to begin to train those skills, although, we do know that they can be improved even in older age groups. And maybe a lot of the training in the adult age groups is about strategy and tactics so much. So maybe one could partly understand that, but certainly in the early age groups, and you can certainly see the under 17 age group here, certainly, only about a third of the practice time were players actually having to make tactical and strategic decisions. So that's the first option. Look at the practice environment. Does that present the right balance between structured and unstructured or play and practice activities? And does it give players enough opportunity to make decisions and to anticipate patterns of play in training? Second option is obviously the interaction between the type of practice activity and the nature of the instruction, and the extent to which coaches should be hands-on or hands-off in this particular process. Some of you might have read or come across the book Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, and he differentiated between two different types of thinking or decision-making. And System 2 is a very conscious level of decision-making, so it's slow, it's generally used in complex decisions, tend to be very reliable. And then System 1 is a little bit more unconscious, it's faster, it's more instinctive, and more automatic. And I guess the interesting argument may be that both types of decision-making are inevitably involved in high-performance sports. Some of it is very conscious, very strategic, working to a definitive plan, and some of it is very intuitive in nature. So I guess the interesting question, what is the right balance between these two types of approaches to decision-making, and how does that impact through the coaching process? And you could argue that, very structured, very prescriptive coaching might be good in terms of developing System 2, conscious thinking. But if you think about the types of environments that may be better at developing System 1, the unconscious thinking, it may well be that low levels of instruction and conditions that better reflect the demands of match play, and where there is significant opportunity for trial and error learning, are probably scenarios that are more likely to develop System 1 decision-making. So to some degree, the argument here is that the nature of the decision-making skills that you develop are somewhat a reflection of the approach to training and the level of instruction that may be provided in these different scenarios. Another approach that is increasingly used to try and develop anticipation and decision-making skills is to use video-based feedback. Certainly in all the soccer clubs, for instance, in the Premier League, even in the youth academy section, it's commonly the case that all games are filmed and that players have access to that video footage and have the opportunity to go back and self-reflect on whether they made the right decisions or the wrong decisions whenever they receive the ball, or even when they're not in possession of the ball. And a lot of feedback may be provided. And increasingly, of course, data analytics is playing a more important role in high-performance sport, particularly also with the advent of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So our ability to analyze large data sets and to, for instance, gain an understanding of the patterns and structures and tendencies of opponents may also be important in developing aspects of decision-making. I suppose the interesting question, though, is that the use of video feedback, the use of data analytics, certainly encourages a very reflective, conscious approach to decision-making, and again, may be very effective at developing System 2 thinking, a slow, strategic decision-making. But one wonders in terms of whether these types of methods are going to be effective in regards to developing System 1 thinking and this more intuitive aspect of decision-making. And there's very little work that's been done on this. And, it fits in with the arguments a little bit under option 2 in terms of what is the relative benefits of very prescriptive or more hands-off approaches to instruction in regards to facilitating the development of these types of skills. Option 4 for the development of these types of skills is really being presented by the availability of both virtual reality and also 360-degree video. Going back 10, 15 years ago, it was quite difficult to create realistic match footage. Certainly in sports like soccer and basketball, maybe less so in volleyball because clearly it's a smaller playing area. But even so, the advent of virtual reality and 360-degree video allows us to create more realistic match scenarios from a first-person perspective. And the plus point, therefore, with virtual reality is that it presents the opportunity to significantly increase repetition. So, for example, if I was doing on-court training, then the amount of opportunities that I may be able to present a player to engage in anticipation and decision-making might be quite limited relative to, in comparison, if I create virtual reality scenarios that involve either upcoming opponents or opponents that are played in recent games. So therefore, the specificity may be lower with VR, but certainly it increases repetition. And in that regard, it may be a particularly helpful tool in regards to promoting the development of these game intelligence skills. One potential downside with virtual reality is the images are still a little bit clunky. So whether it presents the right medium to train the pickup of postural cues or not is open to debate. I think it certainly is going to have benefits in regards to developing pattern recognition skill, because you can clearly see the patterns and you can see them from a first-person perspective. And also probably the use of situational event probabilities. It may well be that video might present a better medium for training the pickup of postural cues, but there hasn't been a lot of research work done. But, certainly virtual reality offers a lot of potential opportunity to facilitate the more rapid types of these skills. And of course, the technology is improving very quickly, whether it's the use of cave-based virtual reality systems or head-mounted displays. These are becoming more accessible, cheaper to use, and also have the advantages that a lot of the work can be done away from training. And this is facilitated by the use of data capture systems that now certainly records, certainly in soccer anyway, records player movements for all 22 players on the field of play. And then that allows them to quickly create these virtual recreations of match play, which in essence allows you to put the player back into the match situation that he or she may have just played in, or allows you to put another player into that situation as if he was facing the opponent that his teammates had played against in the match before. One thing to be wary of to some degree is that I think there's a lot of sports out there at the moment that are investing in VR, but I think VR on its own probably won't be used effectively. I think you need to get the three corners of this particular triangle in place. I think, yes, you need high-tech, realistic VR system, but you also need engagement from the coaches. They buy into this particular process. You need a strong instructional systems design component. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of things that need to be considered as to how do we optimally develop these types of training programs. So these might include questions such as, what age do we do this type of training? Do we do it with young kids, with older kids, with adults? How much of this type of training is effective? What skills do we train? So do we train the pickup of postural cues? Do we train pattern recognition? Do we train gaze behaviors? Do we train the use of situational probabilities? Excuse me. What type of instruction is most effective? Is it prescriptive instruction, or do we provide minimal instruction, guided discovery learning, if you like, and merely give players the opportunity to explore solutions to these types of problems? How do we structure practice? How do we provide feedback? And how do we manipulate stressors like anxiety, physiological workload, mental fatigue? Are, I think, all things that need to be effectively considered if sports are going to optimize the benefits of VR systems within training environments. A couple of books that may be of interest if you want to follow up and read a little bit more about the science. There's a book that I edited a couple of years ago with a colleague, Robert Jackson, called Anticipation and Decision Making in Sport. It's an edited book. There's about 20 odd chapters in it around this particular topic. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a popular science book called The Best, How Elite Athletes Are Made. It's available on Amazon. I wrote it with a journalist, Tim Widmore, who works for the Daily Telegraph here in the UK. And there are a number of chapters in there around perception, decision-making, and what differentiates elite from less elite athletes, and what are the implications in terms of practice and instruction.